Good morning. This was day two at the IFA in Basel, and the discussions today were around the second scientific subject on the taxpayers' rights. The panel did a splendid job on covering the survey from different countries on how each country fared on different parameters that they had laid out in the general report. Um, it was interesting to see how many countries uh, did take into account the special needs of the taxpayers. And at least 20 out of 41 countries had made arrangements for taxpayers with special needs. It was good to know that Korea has the option of braille instructions for the blind taxpayers, whereas in some other countries there are for the deaf taxpayers they had videos in sign languages. Uh, do you do you know what the countries in Asia do about this?
The countries in Asia, not many of them have special legislation or special procedures for taxpayers with special needs. Um, there are some countries in Europe. So, for example, we talked about Switzerland. We had, the secretary of the panel was from Switzerland, and she gave really good insights on how Switzerland really treats its taxpayers. You actually have an opportunity where you can sit down with a Swiss taxpayer and they can help you with filling up the return and helping you with your queries on your tax forms. And she remarked that the only thing probably which they don't do is do some tax planning for you. So that was that was one interesting aspect that brought out. The panel also very interestingly concentrated more on defining the best practices which should be followed globally for protecting taxpayer rights. So the purpose of this panel was not really to kind of name and shame countries as such, or talk about even list countries which are not following any minimal or any best practice standards, but to lay down the global framework of what different countries are doing which can be adopted.
So the other aspect that I noticed and which was of interest was that Switzerland also encourages a practice of explaining the difference in the assessments of different taxpayers.
Yeah.
So if there are different approaches, then they do come out and give the explanation. I think that that's a very good practice to have for the sake of transparency.
Yeah, I think, and since we're talking about Switzerland, one interesting aspect, this country, three languages are spoken, German, Italian and French, and taxpayer as well as the courts have an obligation to talk to the taxpayer in the language that the taxpayer chooses. One very interesting aspect on an overall basis of this panel, and finally we have after a hot sunny week, we have a cloudy day today, and I would think that these clouds also shadow the taxpayers' protection world over. For example, there was a very interesting talk at the end on how the legislation itself is framed. Most of the countries don't have an elaborate process wherein taxpayers are consulted in advance while framing the legislation. Exception being, I think, Australia, not Australia, the New Zealand, where a detailed, elaborate process is followed. I think, specifically in the Indian context, this is being done in very few specific areas, but I think, for me, this is a very important takeaway from this session, that countries should look at legislative making process with the public consultation, and that's core to the fundamental rights available to the taxpayer.
There's also the recommendation, for the OECD to come out with a global manual on the best practices for the tax audits and assessments. And it would be good to, have a model book, so to say, which all the countries can attempt to follow in reducing the hardships that the taxpayers go through. And the pillars that they laid out in terms of whether it was the reasonable notice or the right to be heard, and more importantly the right to remain silent during the course of their assessments.
And naming and shaming.
And naming and shaming,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, I think there was a audience poll wherein the question that was put was whether naming and shaming should be done by countries before the court procedure is completed. And I think almost everybody in the audience voted against it, saying that naming and shaming should not be done. I mean, which is fair because the damages that can occur in a wrongful situation could be disastrous.
They also voted to say that the retrospective legislation should be banned.
Yeah.
Yeah. But also interesting was, they talked about the amnesty scheme, and more interesting was the case of Brazil, where the amnesty scheme is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that occurs every 3 years. And because of the amnesty scheme, Brazil is actually going through a process where there is lack of judicial precedent because everyone just opts for going for the amnesty scheme.
Right.
Yeah, I think on the whole, the 10 or 12 issues that were raised relating to taxpayers' protection rights, again from an India perspective, I think there are a few things to introspect, and not just India. I think many of the countries perhaps will find this session and the general report particularly very relevant as well. Thank you.
Thank you.